Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 3 in this series on World History 2. This is going to be a lecture on the transatlantic slave trade. Not specifically in its mechanics on the ground, but rather, I want to get to an explanation of how this process really began. Because, I like to think that through pop culture osmosis anyway, most of you have a rough understanding of what conditions on a plantation were like. I would hope. But I would rather have a more nuanced and complex understanding of how this decision came about, what drove it, and more specifically, what changes were happening in both Europe and the world system that led to the creation of what we're going to call at the end of this class an Atlantic system, one that will replace the Silk Road as the new engine of the global economy. So, in order to do that, I kind of want to highlight something that I talked about in Lecture 2, which is to say, these four classes, this division of Europe into four main classes, four main groups of people, if you will, right? You have your urban-rural divide and your wealth divide. And that this sort of divides Europe into four quadrants of classes, right? Your urban rich, your urban poor, your rural rich, and your rural poor. The traders, the workers, the nobles, and the peasantry. And as we were seeing in our last class, and the class before that, a couple things are happening in Europe, okay? You're starting to see that these European powers are suddenly becoming flush with cash coming in from the New World, and that New World crops, New World foods, are arriving in Europe, leading to significant urbanization of the continent, where stuff is arriving into Europe and upending the traditional relationship between the nobility and the peasantry, leading to urbanization. Remember, in Europe, if this were a Western 2 class, we'd be talking about the Renaissance during this period of time. But for the purposes of our discussion, what you need to know is that urbanization is occurring in Europe, and that the economic system that existed during this period of time, which is, say, feudalism, has to change, has to evolve. There requires a new era, a new economic system for a new time period. And that's how we got mercantilism. Mercantilism is the earliest antecedent to modern day capitalism. Right? It is what emerges out of this early period in the mid to late 1500s going into the 1600s. A new economic system for a new age. One in which not the fields, but the cities, the new urbanized cities of Europe were the economic powerhouses of these economies. Okay? Now, you have to imagine that an economic system built on these cities and not in the fields is going to have a different relationship between the classes. Okay, you have to think all these peasants arriving in the cities, they're not growing crops in their window boxes, right? We need a new economic system built on money, built on wealth, something that the countries of Europe find themselves suddenly flush with. So, mercantilism as an economic theory bases itself on three main points: production, trade, profitability. Production, trade, profitability. Namely, things are produced to sell for profit. Now, I know what you might be saying. You're saying, Mark, you've just described Business 101. This is just microeconomics. Hold up. Not private individuals, but the state, but the governments. The governments, the kingdoms that exist in Europe at the time are essentially getting into business, taking over entire swaths of their economy, to produce revenue for the state. One of the great ironies of history is that the earliest form of capitalism as an economic system most closely resembles the final form of communism, which is, say, Stalinism. Right? Now, it's not full communism. The state doesn't take over the whole economic system to produce everything, but certain key sectors. The state would take control from start to finish, from farm to table, from production house to marketplace. The state produced wealth, revenue for the government. For reasons that are apparent. We've talked about why these states of Europe might necessitate wealth, going all the way back to Lecture 1, when we talked about the land versus gold dichotomy that Spain found itself in. That gold is infinitely more useful than land, because gold can buy anything. And so the countries of Europe decide that the best thing to do is to just lean in, to do more, to get more of this as a result of their changing economic systems. However, these three ideas on their own do not sufficiently explain mercantilist attitudes. But it is our final 2 points that help us understand how mercantilism works. Now, those of you with backgrounds in political science will understand this a little bit better, but I'm going to explain this the best way I can, the way I would maybe explain these concepts to my international relations students. Namely, mercantilists believe that wealth is a zero-sum game. That wealth is zero-sum. Okay? Now, what does that mean? It means that wealth in relative terms wealth in absolute terms means very little. But in fact, we live in a system of winners and losers. So, when I explain zero-sum to my international relations students, here's where I explain it. Here's how I explain it. And I hope the analogy will make sense to you. Let's say, hypothetically, you are a country, and you are a country that is hell-bent on producing nuclear weapons for your safety and security, okay? And you put all of your resources and all of your energy into this project. And by the end of the day, congratulations, you have produced for yourself one nuclear weapon. Well done. In that same time, however, all of your neighbors have produced 3 nuclear weapons. Have you gotten stronger or weaker? Stronger or weaker? You see, in absolute terms, you got stronger. You did not have a nuclear weapon before. You have one now. You're stronger. But that doesn't matter. All that matters is how many you have in relation to everybody else. Mercantilists think this is how wealth works. Wealth only matters in how much you have vis-a-vis everyone else versus all of your neighbors. How much wealthier you are compared to your neighbors. Especially in a world where, the second point here, wealth is the primary element of a state's power. Okay? A state is more powerful the wealthier it is. Okay? So you take these two things together, you get a zero-sum game. And you're ending up in a position where you are constantly needing to profit maximize. Because it leads to something of a prisoner's dilemma. This sort of thought experiment that we do in political science and in philosophy. This idea that you don't know what your neighbors are doing to make a profit. You can't control what they do. You can only control what you do. And so in such an environment, a country like Spain, not knowing what France is doing, must always assume that all of the neighbors are trying to profit maximize, therefore so must they. Okay? The analogy I give my students in class is, let's say, for example, you're all hungry, and so I bring a giant pizza to class, but that pizza's not cut. And I say, all right, you guys, figure it out. And maybe you were raised to be, responsible, respectful adult, and you only get a small amount of pizza because, everyone else does. But in a world with no rules, you might just take the whole thing and go. And no one else can guarantee what you're going to do. So they can only control their own behavior. Everyone's going to try to pizza maximize and create like almost like a tug of war in all directions where everyone's tugging at the ends of the pizza. Analogy kind of falls apart there. But I hope you get my gist in that. You guys had to read, for this lecture specifically, parts of an economics textbook, and I'm really sorry about that. But the reason why I've included that economics textbook is because within those pages are some rules. There's a primary source in there. German economist Philip von Hornig actually writes down some really useful rules that you can use to think about mercantilism. Okay? Now, not all of these are useful, but I want to highlight a few of these. Okay? I want to highlight a few of these. In particular, I want to highlight at least 3. Number 1, the idea that the way to achieve large quantities of revenue is by minimizing the amount of finished goods being brought into a country, but instead exporting finished goods and focusing more on the refinement of raw materials, number 1. And number 2, that there's quite a few of these that mention that you should be limiting how much gold exits your country, how much gold and silver exits your country, because remember, that's the source of your wealth, okay? So, for example, you want to focus more on bartering, or if you have to bring goods in, make sure that they're raw materials and then you finish them at home because those finished goods have a higher value. All of this matters because, secretly, this explains the transatlantic slave trade. This document and these rules will help us understand the decision to implement the transatlantic slave trade. Now, before I move on, I just wanted to quickly highlight why we might not be mercantilists anymore. And for this, let's talk Scottish wine. This is not an analogy that I came up with, but this is an analogy that Adam Smith came up with, believe it or not, when discussing the reasons why we should stop being mercantilists. So let's say I'm a country like Scotland, and I might want wine. If I want wine, I can't produce this on my own. Remember, the Scots don't produce wine, the Scots produce, well, Scotch, hence the name. So if a Scottish person wants wine today, they would have to import it from other countries. They'd have to import it from Italy. They'd have to import it from France. Countries that would expect money in exchange for that service. Under mercantilism, remember, we don't do that. So under mercantilism, the argument is, well, maybe you shouldn't import wine, but you can import, well, maybe grapes. You could MacGyver together some sort of a greenhouse. You could get a bunch of Scottish dudes in kilts to like stomp on those grapes and ferment it for a little bit, and you'd get a product that would roughly resemble wine. You would drink it, and you'd pull the leg hair out of your teeth and spit it out because it's not very good. But more importantly, Smith argues, well, this would actually cost more. Right? We're spending more money trying to do it in this sort of close-minded way than just going out and buying a better product for less. Right? This is why we're no longer mercantilists. But at the time, people thought this was the right thing to do. So, how do we get to this? Because it is no mean feat to say that the triangular trade, the transatlantic slave trade, was the ultimate reflection of mercantilist ideas. Here's how it works. Step 1 of the triangular trade involves the exportation of finished goods. Remember, mercantilism says you should be producing, as a country, finished goods for export. Right? In this case, let's stick with firearms as a finished goods. Where do these finished goods go? To the west coast of Africa. Okay? Guinea, Ivory Coast, Ghana, although these countries are the products of imperialism, not native borders. So geographically that area, but politically not those countries, you would find various peoples living here. Ashanti people and Igbo peoples, and more towards Nigeria. Shola people, Oyo peoples. Regardless, the Spanish, Portuguese at first, but then also French and British vessels would come with a simpler proposal. How would you like to be king? Right? Imagine the question being put to you. I'll be the devil in this scenario. All right? Imagine the question being put to you. How much would you like to be a king? Just between you and me. I have here a crate full of guns. It would be really easy for you to take over this place if you have guns and nobody else does. So I'm going to wait here on this beach, and I want you to go out, and I want you to bring, let's say, 20 people. I don't care how you get them. Maybe by prisoners of war or abduction. Doesn't matter. Bring them here to this beach. And we'll make a nice trade. Like good mercantilists. Because remember, trade, not cash. I'm not paying. I'm trading, which is what mercantilism says to do. But then, what do? I make other people the same deal. But you can't all be king at once. I've just created a civil war. I've just created my own supply. Because while West Africa is in a state of intense civil war, you will all be fighting each other with the guns that I'm selling, or at least providing. And the more you fight, the more guns you need. And the more guns you need, the more people I will get. You see how this works? You see how this works? And I spent not a dime to do this. These people, all right, and I will refrain from using the word slaves. They are people. People held in slavery. But they are still people. I'm going to try to refrain from using that term because that is not a condition of who they are. All right, and I think you should try to do that too when thinking about these things. Are transported across the Atlantic in large, enormous transatlantic slave ships brought to the Caribbean. To one place in particular, Havana. The port of La Habana, specifically La Casa de Contacion, becomes the epicenter of the transatlantic trade, triangular trade. Simply because it was the world's largest auction house for the sale of human beings. Cuba, specifically Havana, was selected because it was centrally located. Located on the northern coast of Cuba, everything is roughly equidistant from there. Right? It would take the same amount of time to travel to the southern coast of the United States as it would to Mexico, as it would to northern South America and Colombia. And because it was on the northern coast, it was easy for these large vessels to arrive there without having to deal with things like reefs and shallower waters. It was just easier. Okay? From there, like I said, these people are triaged all over the Americas to encomiendas and plantations, producing, well, raw materials. Now, people often say that these are just purely agricultural goods. Correct, but reductive. You see, they're not producing potatoes. It's not wheat or rice that is being produced because there's no money in that. The correct answer is that what is being produced are cash crops. Cash crops. What's a cash crop? A cash crop is an agricultural good that has no value beyond being transformed into a luxury good. Cotton is a cash crop because cotton is turned into fabrics for sale. Tobacco is a cash crop. Indigo turns into dyes. That's a cash crop. Cocoa beans, cash crop. Coffee, as we would see in the highlands of Colombia, cash crop. And king among the cash crops, sugarcane, cash crop. Okay? These goods, a good like cotton, for example, can't be grown to sustain human life. You can't eat cotton. Believe me, people got hungry enough to try. But it was not grown for that purpose. These plantations, these encomiendas, are not producing calories out of the ground. They are producing wealth out of the ground. They are producing raw materials to be transported across the Atlantic, where they will be turned into finished goods. And around and around and around it goes. You get this? Raw materials brought to Europe, turned into finished goods brought to the coast of West Africa, exchanged for human beings who are brought to the Caribbean to produce raw materials. And the European powers make money every step of the way. Every step of the way. And here's where we kind of have to have something of an uncomfortable moment. Because, again, as I said towards the start of this lecture, many of you started watching this with an understanding of what this process looked like. But when asked why, it's a lot more difficult to put to words. Many of you would have said racism, and I'm not going to sit here on the hill and say, oh, this wasn't racist. It was extremely racist. But it wasn't done because of racism. It was done because of profit. And it's a lot harder to talk about the evils of profit making versus the evils of racism in 2024. Right? We have to have an open, and we have to admit this in this conversation. That this system was done because it printed money. This is the new economic system of the world. This Atlantic system will replace the Silk Road. The Silk Road will lose its luster, will lose its value, faced with this, a system that prints money for the powers that engage in it. France, Spain, England, Portugal. And speaking of these countries, remember that prisoner's dilemma that I talked about when we talked about mercantilism, right? Because this process starts with the Portuguese and then with the Spanish. But the French start to think, well, what happens if we don't do it? Well, then we have to do it because we're not profit maximizing. Mercantilism creates an environment where this system is like the ultimate conclusion of it. A system that made these countries money hand over fist. It did. I would posit that if the system wasn't profitable, it wouldn't have happened. And that's the uncomfortable conversation. Because, we still live in a society where profit is a guiding motive for many people. But profit also led to this, and that's where the uncomfortable conversation starts. Now, we will continue this conversation in the videos for this unit, for this module. You also guys have to watch Amistad as part of this module. Dated but very good movie. I hope to discuss this more with you in the discussion section for the film. So, if there are no other questions, guys, I will see you all in our next lecture when we talk about the gunpowder empires. I will see you then. Bye, everyone.